Good morning. Hey, good morning. Okay, we should probably get going here. I'm just going to grab Amanda and B. Okay, so ready to go, people? Ready? Come on in, my friend. Have a seat. Okay, so good morning. Welcome to the first kind of real day of History 12. This is History 12, right? History 12 and our kind of first real day of online and real classes at the same time, which we're going to try to make work. I'm just going to say hello to our internet audience here and see who might be watching this morning. Hopefully it's Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, but probably not. So what we'll do today is just some very easy stuff. We'll talk a little bit about primary and secondary sources. We'll kind of introduce the time period that we're going to look at, namely the 20th century. I have a little bit of reading for you to do and maybe a few questions for you to answer just to kind of, stretch our muscles and see how it goes, right? So easy day today, no problem. Regarding the textbook, things are kind of up in the air because I thought we would be doing, I thought we would just get the textbook from the bookstore and use it, but apparently we're not doing that this term, maybe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to find an online source for the text so that we can all use it. If I can't do that, then I'll figure something out. But either way, this is not for you to worry about. This is for me to worry about. So I will figure it out. But in the meantime, I will post pictures or scans of the textbook on Microsoft Teams so that you can read them. And of course, I'll do that for the online people anyway. So either way, we'll be okay, and I'll figure out the textbook thing. I'm not sure what we'll do. But anyway, don't worry about it. That's my problem, not your problem. Right. So are we good? Good. Any questions that came up from yesterday that maybe you didn't ask that you want to ask? No. Nothing at all. No. Okay. Okay. So we'll get going. Ayushi is here. Good morning. Good morning, Ayushi. And I think Ananda was going to be here too. Maybe. There's a few people watching. Hopefully they'll say hi in a second. I'm going to put this up on the screen and hopefully everybody can see it. Oh, good. Okay, so these are kind of the big, broad ideas for this course. Okay, so all the BC curriculum has kind of big ideas that are baked into their course, and we will talk about these. We will talk about these as we go. We will talk about these as the course kind of progresses, okay? And so one of them you can see here, of course, is that nationalist movements can unite. Hey, it's okay, good morning, come on in, come on in. Nationalist movements can unite people in common causes or lead to intense conflict between different groups. And so the world of the 20th century, and even the modern world, this is kind of a broad idea that you can think about. And so we'll talk a little bit about today. I think we'll talk a little bit about what nationalism is and what it means. And I think once we kind of define it, you'll see evidence of nationalism playing out in global politics today. So it's a very common thing. It can be a very useful endeavor for people to feel nationalism and to be motivated by nationalism. But as we'll see, it can also be a very destructive force as well, depending on how it's used. But we'll talk about that, and you'll see that kind of idea of nationalism come up over and over again in this course. The second one is the rapid development and proliferation of technology in the 20th century led to profound social, economic, and political changes. We like to think, I think we like to think of the time period that we're in now as being one of rapid technological change, right? We've got like new iPhones every 18 months, and we have genetic engineering, we have artificial intelligence. All of these things are kind of rapidly being developed, and it's exciting. But that sort of pace of technological change isn't just limited to right now. The 20th century experiences huge amounts of technological change, lots of that technology related to warfare, because there's 2 world wars and a Cold War to deal with. But there's a lot of technology that comes out of this period that really changes the world and the way it works, okay? And so I'll try to, as we go through the course, I'll try to highlight some of those technologies that really change things for people, okay? And the third one here is, the breakdown of long-standing empires created new economic and political systems. So this is a period where we're kind of entering into sort of the modern age, okay? And so we come into the 1900s from the 1800s. And the 1800s is a period with lots of kings and queens and monarchies and huge empires that span the globe, right? We have the British Empire, and the Dutch are trying to build their own empire. The French are trying to build their own empire. The Germans are doing the same thing. So we have this kind of period of empire building, but eventually that will kind of fall apart, and it will give way to all kinds of different forms of political organization. So we'll have a few democratic countries that are floating around at this time, but we'll have brand new forms of political and economic organization that will come out of this period as well. And again, that will set the stage for the world that we live in today. So I think you will find, or at least I hope you will find, that this is a pretty exciting period of history. There's lots of things that happen technologically, socially, economically, politically, vegetably, minerally, all of these things. All these things. There's massive, massive change that happens during this period. So if I asked you this question, what would you tell me? And I'm just going to back out of this for a second so I can see what online people are saying. So Shania is here, good morning, and Ananda is here, good morning to you. So same question to online people. What is history? What would you tell me if I asked you that? Because I'm asking you that. Okay, so history is past events, right? Things that happened in the past. What else? What else is history? Think big. There's probably no wrong answer to this. Unless you tell me history is a small furry animal or something. That would be wrong. But sorry? It has a great effect on today. History has a great effect on today. Yeah, so the world we live in right now was created by the world of the past, right? Also important. What else? Give me more. Give me more. Give me more. Shania says development. Yeah, so history has developments, right? History has trends that kind of continue through time, right? We can see sort of a pattern of something happening very slowly, right? Or things kind of changing. Hey, good morning, come on in. Things kind of changing very slowly as well, right? So that's true as well. What else? What else is history? Or what do we, maybe even things we think about when we think about history? Past events, we've got developments, we've got trends, we've got, what's that? We have people. What about people? Mm-hmm. We have historical figures. Yes, we do. What else? What else do we have? We have people, we have events, developments, we have the world of the past. We have some mistakes. Yes, people in the past have made mistakes, right? And they've also done some good things, right? What else? What else is history? Okay, Shania also says achievements. Yeah, that's good too, right? So achievements are, I guess we could connect them to technological breakthroughs that we just talked about, but people in the past did achieve things, right? And hopefully we continue to enjoy those achievements in the present, right? Anything else? Anything else? Okay. Laws? Yeah, right. So the laws that people pass, oh boy, the laws that people pass in the past are very important, right? Because they structure what people do in the past, and of course, often laws continue into the present, right? So we're even in Canada today, we're following laws that were not written yesterday. In some cases, they were written 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 years ago, even, right? Cultures have a big role to play in history as well, right? Especially as, come on, trains. Especially as the world starts to get smaller and smaller, right? It's different world cultures have always been in contact with each other for thousands of years. If you took my comparative cultures class last term, you'll remember that cultures were kind of interacting and trading with each other 5,000 years ago, right? So this is not new, but of course the world is becoming more globalized, it's becoming smaller, and people are interacting with each other more and more, and they have to sort of learn to get along, right? They have to learn to cooperate. Let's see. Ayushi says, all the events that lead to the present. Yes, that's very true, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. Shania says wars. Shania says trade. Both of those are also very important historical forces, right? So trade will cause different countries to come into contact with each other, but of course, so will wars, right? Wars will bring people into conflict as well. So, sorry, just a sec. I've got to do two things at the same time. So what I'm going to say here is just to double check, people online, can you see the slide right now? Can you see the PowerPoint slide? I think you can, but I just want to make sure that that's true. Okay, so just let me know if you can see the slide on the screen right now, or has it gone black? Hopefully the slide, right? Okay, so many people think that, of course, history is a collection of names and events and dates, and in part that's true, right? We have, all of those things are important to history, but history is kind of more than that. So it's not just about what happened, but it's about why it happened and how it affects the people involved. And so when you read a history book that's not a textbook, when you read a book about history, Again, history is a story that is created by people, right? And so they kind of pull things from the past and they assemble them into a story that hopefully makes some sort of sense, right? A pile of names and dates and events, if it's not put into some sort of narrative structure, if it's not put into a historical narrative, it doesn't really mean anything, right? If we know that, if we know that Julius Caesar was assassinated on the 15th of March, 44 BCE, well, so what, right? It doesn't mean anything on its own. You have to insert that into a broader story of Julius Caesar or the end of the Roman Republic, right? Those are what give those facts context. That's what gives them meaning. And that's what allows us to, or that's how we identify what parts of history are significant, right? It depends on the story that you're trying to tell, right? Yeah, so historians are going to use a narrative structure. They're going to try to tell you a story, okay? They may try to establish cause and effect, right? So a historian might try to convince you, and this will lead into critical thinking a little bit later, but a historian might try to convince you that the reason that things are the way they are is directly because of this past event, right? Or this past event caused this thing to happen or this situation to follow it, right? So they might be arguing about a cause and consequence type of thing. They also might be trying to explain the significance of events. And so often historians will try to say that, everyone thinks that this historical figure was the most important in Britain during the war, but actually someone else deserves some attention as well. So historians might try to argue that certain people or events might be more significant than you originally thought they were, right? So these are the kinds of things that historians argue about all day, every day, if you're into that sort of thing. Now, this leads us into a little bit of a conversation about bias and objectivity, okay? Now, often people like to think of history as just a bunch of fact, right? And that it's all factual. But that's partly true, but also partly not. I'm just going to check and see. Online people, they didn't answer me yet. Online people, oh, yes, okay, good, perfect. Thank you, Aishi. Okay, that makes me feel better. Whoops. So, again, we often like to think of history as fact, right? As objective, as unbiased. But that's not entirely true either. And so things that are sort of just very basic facts, like Caesar died on the 15th of March, 44 BCE, that's pretty objective. That's a fact, right? But other things that are associated with history are not necessarily factual. They are true from different perspectives, or they might be true depending on what things you think are significant, which things you think are important, right? So history can be seen from different perspectives and can be kind of different degrees of true, depending on who you are and when you live and what kind of things are important to you. So basically what we could define history as broadly is everything that has happened to anyone ever right up to now, okay? Which is a huge amount of information, right? You can't deal with everything that's happened to everyone at all times up to now, right? So of course, historians have to choose certain details, they have to choose certain people, they have to choose certain events in order to tell their story, right? So history is always an incomplete story. You can never explain everything about everyone in all times. And so every time we read history, we have to understand, that there's a lot that's being left out, right? There's a lot of things that we are not, either we don't know or that we can't know, or simply that the writer has decided is not important, right? So they may they may choose to exclude things because they are obviously unconnected, but they also might exclude things because it doesn't help their argument. It doesn't help them convince you of the story that they want you to learn, or the thing they want you to believe. And again, we'll deal with that a little bit later. You can kind of see that happening in this very popular quote. I hope it's by Walter Benjamin. Sometimes quotes online can be attributed to the wrong people, right? But you've probably seen this before, have you not? Yeah. History is written by the victors. And so whoever is in charge, whoever has power, whoever wins the war, whoever controls the country, they're the ones who get to write the history for that particular situation, right? And so they will, of course, choose people that are important to them. They will, of course, portray everything that they've done as good and heroic and noble. And so that's an element of bias that we will have to sort of watch out for, right? Everyone is the hero of their own story, right? And so if you read anything written by Adolf Hitler, for instance, Adolf Hitler thinks he's the good guy, right? Adolf Hitler thinks he's the hero of Germany, right? And of course, most of us would probably agree, based on what we know about Hitler, that he's not the hero, right? He's the bad guy. But of course, to him, he's the hero of his own story. And for a certain time period in Germany, he's the hero of Germany as well. And so how things are presented in a historical narrative, of course, depends on who's presenting them, who the audience is, and also kind of the time period as well, right? And so we have to be prepared for, when we read things that are historical, we have to be prepared for a little bit of bias, right? Depending on who's telling the story, who they're telling it to, and why they're telling that story in the first place, right? Yeah, so everyone who writes history, whether it's a historian, whether it's a historical figure, or whether it's even you and me, we make important decisions about what to add in and what to leave out, right? And of course, that will depend on a number of factors, but we'll deal with those as we go forward. This is a big question. This might be a better question for another time. But the other thing is, who does history belong to? Okay, and I'll try to bring this question back because it's an interesting one, but it's something that we should probably deal with in context. It's something we should deal with when we're talking about something specific. But you know, we've said here that history can be written differently depending on who writes it. But who really gets to say what history is, right? So all of you come from your home countries. Your home countries have a history, right, that I'm sure you probably learned in school, at least a little bit. But who gets to say what that history is, right? Who gets to say what the real version, quote unquote, actually is, right? You can see a little bit of this question being asked in the United States right now. If anyone's paying any attention to the news, there have been, this is probably a few weeks ago now, but there were a lot of protests in the United States and a little bit in Canada about statues, right? About the statues of Confederate generals. Because if you know anything about American history, you know that they had a civil war in the mid-1800s. Northern states, it's more complicated than this, but northern states went to war in order to abolish slavery. Southern states wanted to keep slavery, right? The southern states lost, but there's still lots of statues of Confederate generals, right? So generals from the southern states who fought to preserve slavery. And lots of people, of course, felt that these statues shouldn't be up. We shouldn't glorify people who fought to keep slavery, right? We should get rid of these statues. But many people feel differently. And so you can see not the answer to this question, but the argument around this question happening in real time in the United States and a little bit in Canada as well. who does history belong to? Who gets to say who the heroes are and who the villains are in our story? What should our national story be, right? And so you can see that again happening in the United States. How should we view these historical figures, right? Are they war heroes? Are they historical figures? Are they bad guys? Are they good guys? Are they none of those things? Are they just historical figures? Again, you can see people having a conversation around that question right now. It would be nice if they were actually having that conversation with words instead of with like torches and fists and pulling statues down and things like that. It's getting a little heated, right? But they're discussing that very question in the United States and in Canada right now. Who does history belong to? Who gets to say what our history actually is, right? Let's see. Oh yeah, sources. So in history, we'll say for our purposes here that there's two types of sources, and I talked about them a little bit yesterday, primary and secondary sources, okay? It's important to kind of know the difference between these two because whether we're reading a primary source or a secondary source, it will give us some information about what we can learn from it and how we should see it, and how much importance we might give to this piece of writing, okay? So primary sources are this, and I think I said a much less eloquent version of what's on the screen yesterday, but I think yesterday I said that primary sources are original, unaltered materials that come to us from the time period that we're studying, okay? And so I might go back to that in a second. Yeah, so here's a primary source. This is a marriage certificate. And so we can see here that back in 1917, who are these people here? Back in 1917, Eleanor Anderson and Elmer, sorry. It's not a lesbian wedding in 1917. It's Elmer. Elmer Anderson and Laura May Wilson got married in Carroll County, Iowa. Okay, so this is a primary source. It comes to us from the time. We can learn something from it, right? It can't tell us all kinds of things, but it can tell us a little bit. But it's a primary source. Comes to us from that time period, right? And it's unaltered. Nobody's done anything to it. It's their marriage certificate, right? Here's another primary source. If you've heard of Lewis and Clark, anyone heard of Lewis and Clark? No? It's an American thing. The Americans know about Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark were explorers in I think the 1700s, I believe. See, I should know this, but I don't know my American history that well. Two explorers that set off across the United States before there was the United States, when it was just wilderness that was full of First Nations people. Lewis and Clark set off to kind of explore and discover and map the territory that would become the United States. And so this is the map that it's hundreds of years, or 100 years or so before the United States would exist. So again, we have a primary source, right? This tells us about what Lewis and Clark discovered and how they thought the landscape looked, right? Oh yeah, here's another one. So this is a primary source as well, and so you can see who it's from at the bottom here. This is one of Canada's prime ministers, Sir Wilfred Laurier. He's the guy on the $5 bill, if anyone has any fives on them, on the blue one, Wilfred Laurier, giving a speech in 1904. So right at the beginning of our time period, right at the beginning of the 20th century, he says here, "Let me tell you, my fellow countrymen, that all the signs point this way, that the 20th century shall be the century of Canada and Canadian development. For the next 100 years, Canada shall be the star toward which all men who love progress and freedom shall come." It's very inspiring, is it not? I don't know how true it is. Of course, it was a bit of a prediction that Wilfred Laurier was making. But again, this is a primary source, right? So he was giving this speech at Massey Hall in 1904. Somebody wrote down or probably wrote down, probably not recorded his speech, but that's what he said on that date, right? So this can tell us some things as well. I'm going to come back to Laurier here in a second because I wanted to focus on this second point for a second. So it's tempting to think that primary sources give us objective, factual information about the past. But again, this is not always true. Definitely true here. This is objective, factual information, right? It's a marriage certificate. But is this objective? Is it free from bias? Is it entirely factual? Amanda's shaking her head. Why do you say no, Amanda? Right. So one of the things is that this is not a factual statement. This is a statement of opinion, right? Here's our Prime Minister Wilfred Laurier saying that he thinks, I suppose, I predict that the next 100 years shall be the century of Canada, and everyone will sort of come to Canada and, follow us like a star in the sky kind of thing, right? That's what he says. So one part of this is that this is opinion. It's not fact. The other thing I want to draw your attention to here is who is saying this? Who's saying this primary source? Not me, but in the past. Yeah, our Prime Minister, the Prime Minister of Canada. So who is the audience for this? Who's he saying this to? Yeah. He's talking to Canada as a whole, right? So this is probably a period where radio exists, but people don't really have radios. And so his speech probably would have been written down and published in the newspaper. That's how most people would have had access to this speech. So, but he's talking to all of Canada, right? So my question to you is this. Do you think that Wilfred Laurier says different things to Canada as a whole, the population of Canada, as opposed to, I'm just going to go back here, sorry. Do you think that Wilfred Laurier says different things to his wife while they're having dinner than he does to Canada as a whole? Definitely? What do you think? Yeah, he probably does, right? Because I think we probably all intuitively know that the audience you're speaking to some degree determines what you say, right? Do you say exactly the same things to your best friend as you say to your grandparents? Maybe some stuff, right? But maybe not all things, right? So the audience for a speaker or a writer depends very much on, or influences what is actually said, right? So if you're just writing in your diary, I don't know if anyone has a diary anymore, but imagine you did if you don't. Are you going to say all the things in your diary to your classmates? No, right? That's private, right? That's just for you and yourself, right? When you speak to other people, you may speak differently. You may keep certain things to yourself. You may, not tell them things about you, right? So the audience has a lot to do with what gets said. And it's the same thing for Wilfred Laurier here. Wilfred Laurier is speaking to all of Canada, to all of his countrymen. And so he's going to try to be inspiring, right? He's not going to say, well, the next 100 years look okay, guys. Canada will be good, I guess. Right? He's not going to say that. And he's definitely not going to say, Canada, the next 100 years looks terrible, right? It looks like it's all going to be awful. Canada is going downhill. Run for the hills, right? He's not going to say that either, even if he thinks it, right? Because the role of a country's leader, of course, is to inspire the people, right? To give them confidence, to say, we're going to go out there and show the world what Canada can do, right? They're, in part, the leader's job is kind of cheerleader, right? They're trying to get everybody excited about the country. And so Wilfred Laurier is kind of doing his job here. He's saying, yeah, the next 100 years looks great. We're Canada, this is going to be the century of Canada. Everyone's going to follow our example because we're going to be so awesome, right? That's part of his job. And so because he's talking to all of Canada, he will communicate that message. Now, does he actually think that? What do you think? Does he actually think that? Who knows, right? Maybe he does, right? It's very possible that that's actually the way he feels. But we can't entirely be sure. And this is where the sort of bias and objectivity comes in. This is really what he's supposed to say as a prime minister, right? He's supposed to say good things about the country. And so we don't really know if this is the way he felt or not. Maybe he did. How might we, if we were historians, which we can pretend we are, if we were historians, how do you think we could figure out if he really felt that way or not? What could we do as academic historians? Say again? Okay, we could compare his actions to his words. We could see if he actually acted in accordance with that statement, right? What else? Maybe we could do a little digging. What do you think? Do you think Wilfred Laurier kept a diary or a journal? We don't know. Some prime ministers did, which I'll get to in a minute. But maybe we could find those writings, right? Maybe he kept a personal journal or a personal diary, and then maybe we could see what his actual thoughts were. And maybe he thought that thing. Maybe he thought that the next 100 years were going to be awesome for Canada. On the contrary, maybe he would have felt that, well, I'm not sure how it's going to go. But again, he can't really transmit that message to the people, right? The people need a good message. And so Wilfred Laurier is going to go up there like a prime minister, and he's going to give them a message that makes everybody feel good and empowered, right? So what I'm drilling home here is that this isn't a perfectly objective statement, right? We don't know whether the next century is going to be Canada's century. Well, we do now because it's in the past. But at the time, Wilfred Laurier didn't know that. He was guessing or hoping or giving his opinion. And of course, his audience was all of Canada. And so he kind of has to say something positive, right? He has to say something big. And so he does. So this is a statement that he made. But again, there's some bias introduced here because of his audience, and because of his audience, and because of the fact that he's offering his opinion here, right? We don't quite know if he felt this way or not, or if this is actually true or not. Yeah. So what we should remember about primary sources is that they are always biased. It's very tempting to assume that because things come to us from the time, that people must have known, right? They must have known how it was. They were there, right? But imagine this. I'm going to write a book, okay? And my book is going to be titled The Real Justin Trudeau. And in my book, I'm going to tell you all about what Justin Trudeau is really like. Not the man you see on TV giving those press briefings in front of his Rideau cottage. I'm going to tell you what he's really like as a person. And I'm going to write my book and sell it, and hopefully it'll be a bestseller and make me rich. Okay? So let's actually do that. Okay? And in 200 years, so in 2220, somebody picks up my book and reads it and was like, oh, this is what Justin Trudeau was really like, people. Is my book reliable? Should the historian believe what I say in my book? What do you mean no? Why not?
Because it's your opinion, not everyone's.
Because it's my opinion, okay. But what's the big problem? I might be biased, right? I might really like Justin Trudeau and I might want to make him seem really cool, or I might really dislike him and I might want to make him seem like a jerk. But what else? You what? Why is it wrong?
Because your opinion is not here about yourself.
Right. I wrote it about someone else, and
You don't have proof.
I don't have proof because. Do you think I know this guy? No, I don't know him, right? I don't know Justin Trudeau. I've never been in the same room as him. I've never been in the same building as him. The most I can say is I've been in the same city as him at the same time. But I don't know him. I've never met him. I've never talked to him. I've never spent any time with him. I don't know anything, right? So again, I could write that book, and it would be written at the time of Justin Trudeau, right? And so the historian in 200 years would be looking at this book and saying, oh, this Mike Metcalf guy lived at the same time as Justin Trudeau. He must have known. But I don't. I never met the guy, right? No idea what he's like. All I know is what we all see on TV and what we read. So, yeah, this is the bias thing or the opinion thing, right? All primary source writers write from their own perspective, right? So they have knowledge of some events and they have ignorance of other events, right? So here with the Justin, and they might write their opinion rather than fact. So with the Justin Trudeau example, I have knowledge of some events and ignorance of others. So I know what I see on TV. I know what Justin Trudeau says on TV and on YouTube. I know what he says in interviews, but I have ignorance of other events. I don't know what he's like, when he takes off the tie and sits on his couch and says, "Ugh, what a day," right? I don't know what that's like. I don't know what he's like because I've never spent any time with him. And again, I might be writing my opinion. I might think he's really great, so I write a really nice book about him. Or I might really dislike him and I might write a very sort of unflattering book about him. Either way, I'm letting my opinion cloud that. And so someone in 200 years might assume that my primary source book is far more authoritative, is far more accurate and factual than really it actually is, right? So just because somebody writes something in the past and they were there at the same time, or maybe even there at the same place, doesn't necessarily mean that they know what they're talking about, right? And again, I could write a whole book on Justin Trudeau and I wouldn't know what I was talking about. I just happened to live in the same country as him at the same time, right? Yeah, we know that primary sources write for a certain audience. And so it's always important to ask who's this person speaking to? Is it their diary, right? Are they just talking to themselves? And so it's a very private conversation. Is it an editorial? Are they writing for a newspaper? Is it a political speech like Wilfred Laurier? All of these things have different audiences, and so people are going to say different things. Wilfred Laurier, for the country of Canada, in his political speech, says that everything is going to be awesome for Canada in the next 100 years. In his diary, he might have wrote the exact same thing. Or he might have said, ooh, I'm not real confident in Canada's position in this next century, right? So again, the audience is going to have a big effect on what the source actually says. Okay, secondary sources. Now, these are probably more familiar to us because this is where most of history is kind of made, okay? And so secondary sources are sometimes documents, sometimes recordings, and sometimes written things that are created by people who are not actually present. And usually they are created from primary sources. So who in this room has seen a documentary on anything? On anything at all? Any kind of documentary on mole rats or the history of communism or Taylor Swift or anybody? Yeah, because Taylor Swift had she had kind of a documentary thing on Netflix a few months ago, right? What was it called? forget what it's called. Anyway, let's use Taylor Swift. So little documentary about Taylor Swift, about her, writing music and struggles with the media and all kinds of things were wrapped up in that documentary. And it's a secondary source, right? So we have her own words, right? So we have recordings of things that she said. We have some footage of her, right? We have some video of her performing on stage and, talking to her friends and, writing songs on her guitar and, crying because she's upset and things like that. And the person who makes the documentary sticks all of those together, right? They assemble them all, things she's said, things she's, video pieces that we have, puts them all together to tell a little bit of a story about Taylor Swift, right? So all of those things in the documentary are primary sources, right? There's video of her, writing a certain song or something like that. And then they go into the documentary, and the documentary is a secondary source. And hopefully, if the documentary is any good, hopefully it tells us some kind of a story, right? Hopefully it has a point to make. Hopefully it says something about Taylor Swift, or it says something about Taylor Swift at this point in her career, or maybe it says something about music or life in general. Who knows? I actually don't remember what the point of it was, but hopefully there was a point to this documentary. And so, so all secondary sources use primary sources in order to tell a story, to make an argument, to allow us to see history in a different way, okay? And any textbook you pick up is a secondary source. Any book, a biography. Has anyone read a biography of anybody? Anybody? Maybe? Yeah. Any biography is a secondary source, unless it's actually written by the person whose the biography is about. Any documentary, any textbook, any history book, all of those are secondary sources assembled from primary ones, right? Yeah. So this one came out a number of years ago, Unbuttoned, A History of Mackenzie King's Secret Life. And so this was another one of Canada's prime ministers here, William Lyon Mackenzie King. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Mackenzie King was prime minister in Canada for the longest. And so I think he served a couple of terms, and then he was kicked out, and then he got back in later. And so in terms of length of service, he was Canada's prime minister for the longest. And it turns out he was a bit of an odd duck. He was a bit of an odd person. He didn't appear so in the media. In the media, he looked like, a prime minister, right? An old white guy, who our prime ministers usually tend to be here in Canada. But this book, this secondary source, was assembled because the author got access to Mackenzie King's private writings, private journals. And so Mackenzie King kept a journal, kept a diary. He didn't show it to anyone, right? It was just for him. And in his will, he asked that the journals be destroyed because he didn't want anyone to read them for obvious reasons, right? But they weren't destroyed. And so this author actually got access to them. And so in them, we see that he's kind of, he's kind of an odd guy, right? So we hear stories about him, engaging with prostitutes, which of course we didn't know about when he was prime minister. He believed in ghosts and believed that you could talk to them. And so I think he had like seances and things like that to communicate with the dead. People didn't know that at the time when he was prime minister. He had a very strong and maybe just like a little too strong relationship with his mother. We're not really sure what was going on, but he was really very firmly attached to his mother, even as a 40 or 50-year-old man kind of thing. So he had some odd things happening with him. But again, these are things that we didn't really know about Mackenzie King when he was alive. And they were certainly not things that he ever shared with the Canadian public, right? So when Mackenzie King talked to Canadians, he didn't talk about his, communing with ghosts. He didn't talk about the prostitute he saw last night. He didn't talk about any of those things. And of course not, right? Of course he would not talk about those things. But in his journal, he does, because the audience was different. The audience was just him. And so he felt comfortable, of course, sharing his personal thoughts. But he doesn't share them in public. So, oh yeah. Yeah, so secondary sources, again, are assembled from primary sources, but they're not unbiased either because, sorry, just one second here. But secondary sources aren't unbiased either because they're trying to tell a story, right? They're trying to make a point. They're trying to convince you of something. And so the book we just talked about with Mackenzie King, I haven't read the book, I'll confess, but I think what the author of the book is trying to convince you of is that, Mackenzie King was kind of a different guy. He was not the guy that you thought you knew as Prime Minister of Canada. And here's all this extra information that gives us a better picture of who this human person was. He wasn't just what we saw in the media as, Prime Minister of Canada. He was actually a much more complicated and, slightly odd character, right? And so the book has something to convince us of, right? And so that's, we should be ready for that as well in secondary sources. Secondary sources are trying to convince us of something in addition. Let's see. Oh yeah, okay, so Shania's seen the Taylor Swift documentary. So Miss Americana was what it was called, I think. That was the one on Netflix, if anyone's going to go home and watch it now. Okay, so let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back in 10 and we'll talk a little bit about World War I, okay? So 10-minute break. Okay, and we're back. So, um, as you no doubt remember from 10 minutes ago, we've just been talking a little bit about what history is and how, basically, and how do we know about it, right? And so, history, of course, we said is facts and dates and events and things like that, pieces of data, but those data are always assembled in some sort of narrative structure and some sort of story to tell us something about the past, right? Now, we said that history comes to us usually from two types of sources, either primary or secondary ones. Primary comes to us from the time period that we're studying. Secondary sources are assembled later, usually from primary sources, sometimes from other secondary sources. And those are the ones that are trying to tell us what history means, right? They're trying to tell us what the significance of events or people in the past was. They're trying to show us why things happened the way that they did. And so most of the history that we will encounter are secondary sources. But I'll try to add in some primary sources too, because those can give you a real window into, depending on the source you have, a real window into sort of what people were thinking and feeling at the time, right? And that's kind of, I think, where history gets interesting, is to imagine what people's lives were like at the time and how they were feeling about things. So that brings us to World War I, or almost World War I. Quick show of hands, who's studied World War I in the past? Ooh, couple people. Okay. All right. Here's where we'll start. So we have to kind of set the stage for this period of history by talking a little bit about what had happened prior to the 1900s. And so we're kind of looking here at a period, let's say there's about a 300-year period in global history and world history where the New World is discovered, quote unquote, by Christopher Columbus, right, in 1492. Explorers start going to North and South America and sort of taking over the place and extracting resources. And at the same time, there are certain countries that start to develop an empire, right? So they start to take over other places around the globe. They start to take resources from those countries and funnel them back into their home country to start producing things industrially, right? Start producing things with machines. And so there's lots of technology that goes into this prior to the Industrial Revolution. The first ones have to do with spinning cloth, right? So people are, in Britain and France mostly, are able to generate huge amounts of cloth very quickly and very cheaply, far more quickly and cheaply than they could before. And so people start producing cloth on an industrial scale, on a huge scale. But other types of industries soon follow, and soon we have this kind of industrial revolution, right? We have an industrial engine in certain Western European countries that are extracting resources from other places around the globe and using it to manufacture huge amounts of products and get super rich in the process, right? And so, again, we see globalization happening even a few hundred years ago, where we've got lots of shipping. We have people extracting resources from India, from Africa, from North and South America, from Southeast Asia, and cycling them back into Europe to be produced as goods and then sold to the rest of the world. And so we've got lots of shipping, we've got lots of global trade, and we have lots of countries who are basically running around the globe, or who have been running around the globe, taking over other places in order to secure their resources. And so, as you probably already know, but you can see on the map here, you can see that Britain managed to take over large pieces of the world, as did France, and of course, really all of the sort of Western European countries are in on this, trying to grab as much control of global resources as they can in order to use those resources to manufacture goods and make themselves super, super rich, right? Which works. All of those Western European countries that you see in the process of this, well, maybe not so much Russia, but all of them become pretty significantly wealthy and powerful in this period of time, right? And this is prior to about 1900. So when we land in our time period, which is, let's say about 1914, when we land in that period, we have a world that kind of looks like this. It's a world of empires that are where the power is centered in Western Europe. So Western Europe has the economic and the military power in order to, exploit the rest of the globe and control their territory and their ability to do things. Now, World War I gets going for a complex series of reasons. If I just asked you, and maybe I will ask you, what do you know about, and online people can answer this as well. What do you know about the beginning of World War I? How does this whole thing get going?
There was some tension growing between the nations all along. Basically, you can see that everyone were talking behind each other's back, no one wanted to get the other one. And then eventually what sparked the war was that a certain Archduke of Austria went down in the country and got assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Austrians demanded, they blamed the Serbians, and they had some seriously terrible demands from the Serbians, and which they responded as, no way on earth would do that. So they went back to their German friends and said, basically was like this, will you back us up? And they did. They attacked, and then France declared war, and then Germany decided to go to take France. Up to this point, Britain wasn't really involved in the war. There was a defensive line on the German-French border that the French didn't bother to take it all the way up to the coast. So Belgium was like a border between France and Belgium wasn't defended. So the Germans asked the Belgians would they allow them to move the troops and move Belgium. The Belgians said no. Germany invaded Belgium, and then Britain declared war, and basically the whole thing got bad and worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mostly correct, right? So there's a few. You are right, and so this is a complicated picture in terms of how this war gets going, because again, there are some sort of broad trends that lead to it, and then there are some individual events that kind of set things in motion, right? And so, you mentioned a few of those, and so that's good. But let's just dive into it, because that was a lot, right? that was a lot of the picture right there. Right. So one of the sort of background causes to World War I is this issue of Balkan instability, and so the Balkans are kind of an area. I should actually have a good map of them, but I don't. I'll put one in for tomorrow. The Balkans are kind of a series of small countries that are kind of to the southwest of Austria, okay? And so these countries are controlled by Austria, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so we have a little empire centered in Austria at the time. And they're controlling that area because it's important for trade. So they have a lot of trade going through that area. But unfortunately for the Austrians who are trying to control that area, the area is very diverse in terms of cultures and religions and ethnicities. And so that whole area is under the control of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, okay? So we've got some instability in the Balkans here, and that sort of, as you mentioned, that promotes people to start to produce weapons, okay? And so, again, everyone starts to feel that, in that Balkan area, there's a lot of fighting already. So these different nationalities and different ethnicities, they don't want to be ruled by Austria-Hungary. They want to have autonomy. They want to rule themselves in their own country. They don't want to listen to the Austro-Hungarians, right? So there's a bunch of little wars that happened. There's lots of terrorism that's happening at the time. And Europeans are concerned that a war is coming. And so people start building weapons. Unfortunately, when the country next door to you starts to build weapons, then you start to build weapons, right? Because you start to get fearful, you start to become afraid, right? What are your neighbors going to do with all of those guns and bombs? Are they going to use them against me? Maybe I better build my own stuff. And so everybody starts to arm themselves in the early 1900s, right? Nobody's sure what's going to happen. Nobody's quite sure where the threat is going to come from, but people become nervous, people become apprehensive, and they start arming themselves. Germany is getting nervous as well, so they start to arm themselves, and they develop this Schlieffen Plan, which we'll talk about the Schlieffen Plan a little bit later. Yeah, so many countries start to build up their military. And of course, the more weapons that are around, the more chance that people are actually going to use them, right? So people are building all kinds of munitions, they call them, all kinds of military technology. And so people are concerned that something's going to happen. Something's going to bubble over and we're going to get a big conflict. And so in order to try to alleviate the tension a little bit, we see that a number of European powers enter into alliances, right? And so the idea here is that I don't really want, I'm worried that someone's going to attack me. And so if I ally myself with a few other countries, that means that if you attack me, you're attacking all those other countries as well. So maybe you won't attack me, right? Maybe I have enough backing that you won't attack me if I've got big, powerful friends. And so again, we see alliances start to develop. And so France and Great Britain and Russia ally themselves or ally themselves with each other. And Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire ally themselves as well. And so again, the idea here is that an attack on one is an attack on all. And so the idea here is that it would keep war from breaking out. Obviously, we know that that's not going to happen, but that was the idea. Yeah. So right prior to the beginning of World War I, this is kind of the Europe that we're dealing with. And so you can see here, you can see the Balkans there just north of Greece, right? So you can see Serbia is down there, Albania is down there, Montenegro is down there. And this is an area that has, and still to this day has, a number of different religions and ethnicities and cultures. And at the time, they're all kind of stuck in that area of the world, controlled by Austria-Hungary, and none of them are really happy being ruled by Austria-Hungary because they are nationalistic, right? So we'll talk about nationalism in a second. They want to rule themselves, right? The Serbians feel that they should have their own country, but that it should be autonomous and not under the control of Austria-Hungary, and they should be able to do what they want, right? Yeah, so these are our alliances going into World War I. You'll see that a number of countries are neutral, right? So they're not part of this alliance system. And so you can see Spain and Norway and Sweden and Denmark have chosen to sit this out. The Netherlands and Belgium have chosen to sit this one out. Poor Belgium. Poor Belgium always tries to stay out of these conflicts, and they always get pulled in. But this is kind of the world that we're looking at going into this. Right. So we talked about this first thing this morning, right? The idea that nationalism can be kind of a force for good or a force for maybe not evil, but it can have destructive ends, right? Now, what would you say, how would you define nationalism for me if I asked you, because I'm asking you? What would you tell me? What's nationalism? Say that one more time. Thinking that.
Thinking that your own country and your countrymen are above everything and anyone else.
Ooh, okay. Okay, so thinking that your own country and the people in your country are, above everyone else and that they're better than everyone else? And that you're always right? Okay, good. What else is nationalism? And online people, you can answer this as well. I'll watch your answers right here. What else is nationalism? Or maybe if we get rid of that ism on the end, what's a nation? It's a country, okay. What else is it? Or what else makes a nation? People, cultures, religions. Yeah, what else? What else might identify a group of people as a nation? What's that? Flags, borders, governments, okay. Sorry? Beliefs, yeah. Shania says here that this is the idea of nationalism, that their country is superior to others. Okay. What else? What is nationalism, or what identifies people as a nation? We talked about cultures and ethnicities, governments, flags, religions maybe, borders, certain geographical areas. Where they stand? What do you mean? Like physically? Like Asgard, where their people stand?
The way they're together and not against each other, but together against others.
Oh, okay, yeah. Maybe the fancy word that you might be looking for here is they have a sense of solidarity, right? So they feel that they're together, right? That they stand together as one group, and they are united against maybe people from the outside, people who are not part of the nation, right? Yeah, all of those things are true. So here's what a nation is, just to start off with. And this is kind of important. This will come up. This will definitely come up for Nazi Germany. The idea that a nation is a large group of people with common characteristics. And of course, language might be part of that. So a group of people that speak the same language. It might have to do with their traditions or their customs or their habits. So their culture, they might share a culture. Their ethnicity. So again, they might share kind of a cultural or historical, this isn't going to sound very good, they might share a history together, right? They might have a shared history, these people. And so what a nation is kind of a cultural group that has kind of a political basis to it as well. And it's a group that has become conscious of its autonomy and unity and interests. And so, Aliana, that's kind of what you were saying in terms of solidarity. A nation is a people who are kind of similar. They have a similar history, maybe culture or language or religion, and they start to see themselves as one single group. They start to see themselves as a body of people who are separate from others and that have a group of interests that belong to them, right? And so, yeah, that's kind of what a nation is. And so, there's a lot on this slide, but maybe we can look at it anyway. So, the sort of feeling or the concept of nationalism is one that says that the nation is the only way to create a state. And so, Ahmed, right? Yeah. Some of the things that you were saying in terms of like flags and governments, those are more commonly associated with a state, right? So a sort of a political unit. But you're right in saying that, because often we have this idea, or at least in the 20th century, we had this idea that the way we should create states is based on nations, right? So we have a nation, we have a group of people who are kind of similar and they see themselves as a group, and we should put them in a state with borders, and they'll have a flag and a government, and they'll be able to kind of just rule themselves and do what they want as a nation state, right? That's kind of the idea behind really most of the countries, most of the states that exist today. Although you're probably thinking to yourself, well, that's not usually the way it goes, because every country has different nations within it, right? There are different religious, ethnic, cultural, linguistic groups in every country. And so it's kind of an idealistic thing, right? Is the idea that a state should be full of a single group of people who, are part of a nation and they can rule themselves. In reality, it never works out that way, but that was kind of the idea to creating states in the 20th century. So this concept of nationalism, of the idea that people of a certain nation should rule and govern themselves, was very influential in the 20th century, and to some degree still is. In the United States now, again, if you're paying attention to the news, you'll see that there is a very strong current of white nationalism, right? And so there are people in the States who pretty strongly believe that America is a nation of white people, right? Of white Christian people, and that that's who the country should be for, and that other people should somehow go away, right? They should leave or get out or go away somehow, so that America can be the white nation that some people think that it should be. And of course, it's not hard to see elements of that white nationalism in the speech of some people in the US. So again, we have this concept of nationalism that is very popular in the 20th century, but there's still elements of it kind of filtering through the modern world. And again, you can see kind of a very ugly version of that in the United States with white nationalism. Oh yeah, okay. So here we go. What's my timing? Does this class end at 9:50? 9:45? Okay. 9:40. Oh, 9:40, that's right. We've gone back, sorry, it was 9:50 last term, 9:40. So I've got 10 minutes. Okay, so this is what you are referring to. So we've got this kind of background, these background trends of instability in the Balkans occurring before World War I. We have militarism, so we have people building up their militaries, which is always not a great idea because guns that get built tend to be used eventually. We have this alliance system where certain countries ally with others, thinking that nobody will attack me if I've got big, powerful friends, which is not an uncommon thing, right? NATO was created for that very reason, right? NATO is, if you attack one NATO member, you're attacking them all, except for the US, because Donald Trump won't come to your rescue, but that's another story. So that there's these kind of long-term trends that are happening, and then we have this one event that sparks the whole thing. And it has to do with a group of terrorists, interestingly enough. And so this terrorist group is called the Black Hand, which is pretty much the coolest name for a terrorist group I've ever heard. The Black Hand is a terrorist group from Serbia. But of course, if you're from Serbia, you probably wouldn't think of them as terrorists. You'd probably think of them as freedom fighters or, nationalistic heroes. But either way, this Serbian group called the Black Hand decides they're going to assassinate the Archduke of Austria-Hungary. And So again, Serbia is pushing for autonomy. They don't want to be ruled by Austria-Hungary. They want a nation state. They want to rule themselves. And so what they're trying to do is push for that, and they're going to assassinate the Archduke. And so they're looking for independence, the Black Hand is. And so they hatch this plot to kill Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So this is kind of a funny story, and I'm hoping I'm going to get the details right here. It's a very strange thing that happens. So it's kind of a stupid thing. It's kind of a comedy of errors how this works. Tell me if this is the version of the story that you remember. So the guys from the Black Hand decide that they are going to assassinate the Archduke, and they get word that the Archduke is going to drive through town in sort of a convertible car in a bit of a parade, so that all the...
They read that in a newspaper.
Yeah.
Like it was published that this is the way the Archduke is going to stay.
Yeah, so all the people can, I don't know, stand and wave to him. This is in Sarajevo, right? So in Sarajevo. So the Black Hand is like, okay, here's the plan. We're going to stand in the crowd and wave like all of his fans, but each of them, the Black Hand members are going to have a grenade. And so when the Archduke drives by, they're going to toss a grenade into his car and assassination, right? So on the day of the parade, or the day that Archduke Ferdinand is driving through Sarajevo, the Black Hand has a few members in the crowd. And so the version I read is that the car drives by the first guy with his grenade in his pocket, but there's like a police officer too close to him. So he kind of chickens out. He doesn't do it. But they've got another person in the crowd. And so when the car gets to the second guy pulls his pin and throws it at the car, but he misses. So he misses the car. The car drives by too quick. You've got to throw ahead of the car if you want to. Anyway. So he misses the car, and the grenade rolls under the second car that's coming. That car blows up. The car with Archduke Franz Ferdinand, they freak out and they speed off. And so basically the plot is ruined, right? So the Archduke has fled. There's chaos, and the cops are there, and the Black Hand are running away, and it's a disaster, right? The plan doesn't go well. And so anyway, the car with the Archduke is kind of trying to escape, and they wind up a little bit later taking the wrong route back to the government building that they're trying to get back to. They take the wrong route, and they wind up coming to a dead end in the street. And so they come to a dead end, and the driver's like, and he's trying to back the car up to turn it around. And just then, this guy, Gavrilo Princip, comes out of a shop, or I don't know if a coffee shop that he's in. He's getting his caramel macchiato or whatever. Comes out, and he's a member of the Black Hand, Gavrilo Princip is. And there's the Archduke in the middle of the street in this car that's trying to awkwardly turn around. And so this is his big moment. And so he walks up, pulls out his gun, and shoots the Archduke and I think he shoots his wife too. Yikes. Shoots them both in the car right there. So the original plan is a disaster and doesn't go anywhere near according to plan, but through this kind of accidental fluke and Gavrilo being in the right place at the right time.
The last one was a bit different than the version I've heard.
Uh-huh.
It says that the Archduke actually tries to go sometime later to the hospital where the injured officers are, and then the
Oh, okay. Okay, so there's a little bit of a time gap between. Okay, that does sound familiar. I think you're probably right about that. Either way, fluke, right? Total fluke. So Franz Ferdinand with his epic mustache is murdered. Gavrilo Princip here, a pretty handsome looking guy. He looks like he got beat up a little bit after the cops caught him. But he is arrested for the murder, right? And of course, this is going to set the whole thing off and, of course, inadvertently cause the death of millions and millions of people, which is a little bit, in a way, it's kind of odd. It's a little bit ironic because, first of all, Serbia is not a very big place. Most of the people in Western Europe that will get involved in this war probably don't care about Serbia. Maybe some of them don't even know where it is. So that's kind of odd. The other thing is that Franz Ferdinand isn't that big of a deal in Austria-Hungary. Yes, he's an archduke, but he's like 8th in line for the throne. So he's not that important or powerful. Other members of the royal family, I think, had been assassinated already. So it's not like he was the first member of the family to get assassinated either. So there's kind of nothing incredibly significant about this particular assassination or the two people who are involved. Gavrilo is kind of a nobody. He's a big historical figure now, but at the time he was nobody. And Franz Ferdinand isn't that big of a deal in the royal family either. But because of all these other things that are happening, this is the event that sparks, a huge war. So, we've only got 1 minute left. So I'll leave it there for today. Come back tomorrow and we'll look at how this sort of World War thing starts to ramp up. And yeah, we'll carry on from there. So online people, thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions, you can talk to me a little bit later on Microsoft Teams. But other than that, we're out of time, so I'll let you go. It was great to have you here. Yeah, have a nice rest of the morning or evening. Okay, so bye.